Hi, thank you all for being here. I am really excited to give this presentation. My name is Will Penman. I just finished up my PhD at Carnegie Mellon this spring, and now I'm at Princeton for a little bit. And this comes out of my larger dissertation project, the possibility of adapting liturgy for anti-racist rhetorical work. So I want to begin with a question that I feel like this group of rhetoric and religion interested scholars will appreciate, which is, what rhetorical work does liturgy do? I'm personally relatively unaware of people who have really addressed this question. I would love to hear from you if you know of things. I was actually just in Annie's panel earlier this morning, and I think she kind of touched on some of that by addressing semiotic mediation. Thank you. Some kind of like standard rhetorical work. I think George Kennedy is skeptical of Christian refusals to treat persuading others as an art. So he talks about these kind of disturbing places in the Bible where Christians are represented as not really being interested in persuading people. And he is a little skeptical of what that does and sees it as opposing kind of a traditional understanding of rhetoric. And then we can also view liturgy as a kind of ritual, and there's a skepticism toward that too. So kind of informally, we might say some of the work that liturgy does is it makes people feel good, and it connects them to some kind of tradition. And I would just kind of broadly argue that's a really weak view of what liturgy does, that I think we can deepen both rhetorically and theologically. So the thesis that I want to present today is that we can theorize Christian liturgy rhetorically through the concept of responsiveness. So first I want to talk about rhetorical responsiveness, liturgical responsiveness, and then dive in just a tad into the people I was working with and bring out one or two concrete examples. So rhetorically, responsiveness is kind of coming into vogue as a more expansive way to think about rhetoric. So we can look at Burke, who emphasizes mutuality. We can think about invitational rhetoric, which goes in a really extreme feminist direction. We can think about Krista Radcliffe's work on rhetorical listening and how reception is actually a special art. And then I'm particularly partial to Diane Davis's formulation of rhetoricity, where she's saying before you can even get to persuading other people, there is a kind of ontological connectedness to others, where our exposedness to others allows us to persuade them. So there's a variety of rhetorical work out there that says rhetoric is really productive when theorized in terms of responding to others, and maybe persuasion then is kind of the oddball out rather than the dominant paradigm. There's actually also some work where white anti-racism is theorized as being at its core a responsiveness as well. So this is an undoing of the hiddenness that privilege brings. So to give some examples, Ta-Nehisi Coates says it's so easy to look away from the realities of systemic racism, implying there that the looking itself and the deciding to attend is itself an anti-racist move. Then we have a different George Yancey than Ben was talking about. This is the philosopher George Yancey, speaking in a really theoretical Levinasian perspective a little bit, nurturing a disposition to be unsutured, to crack, re-crack, and crack again the calcified operations of the white gaze. And so really there's this undoing process, a willingness to be exposed that is at the heart there. Then one of my project participants read an early draft of one of my chapters and said, vulnerability is maybe the word that you're looking for. So I think this isn't something that's just in a very high theoretical register, but can also be articulated and felt by white participants seeking tact against racism. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of theory on the rhetorical side that prepares us to see responsiveness as interesting and relevant. Let's think about liturgy. Liturgy, I would say, can also be seen theologically as a responsive move. So scholars talk about liturgy in a variety of ways, from like very narrow to very broad, and I want to kind of pick some pieces of both those. The most common one is a pretty narrow definition, which is that there are certain orders of a worship service that constitute it as liturgical. So here we're thinking of Catholic, Orthodox services, some mainline Protestant services, and it has a certain structure. There is a call to worship. There is a confession. There is Eucharist usually in these kinds of services, and so there's a certain flow to the service. So this is a very narrow view of saying what is liturgical, and here it's a liturgical type of church, which is usually contrasted with kind of an evangelical type of church. A little bit broader is to say, we really want to view it as any shape of a church service, and so now evangelical and liturgical churches can be analyzed both in terms of the liturgy that they're presenting. You can go a little bit broader, and other scholars say, well, we can think of it also more materially, who gets to talk when, where, at what times, and so really thinking about the context there. And then the broadest, I would say, is from James K. Smith, and he conceives of liturgy in a more theoretical way that really amounts to habit, any and all formative processes. So I think there's something that we can get out of both the narrow and the broad views on liturgy, and really think through what are they saying theologically about what it means to respond to God and other people. From a narrow view, liturgy really emerges as interactive, as pulling people in. So we see this in the call and response structure of many liturgical elements. The Lord be with you and also with you. Let us give thanks. Thanks be to the Lord, right? And whatever the call and response is, the call structure draws people in to the response. So I think initially, as a rough heuristic, we can say liturgy can kind of be equated rhetorically to this call and response structure. What we get out of a Christian liturgy view specifically, beyond just call and response, is a few aspects. Often liturgical call and response is fixed, often meaning in practice that it's written down. It's communally authored or written, so it has the authority of the denomination or some kind of backing. It's often narrative, so the types of liturgies that you do within a certain structure might change depending on, say, the church year. And, narrative would be within the service. It varies, so the kinds of call and response that you're doing toward the beginning, say, like corporately confessing, would be different than the kinds that you're doing toward the end where you're calling each other to go out. And then we have the seasonal aspect where it can change over time. And I would say that already initially this liturgical view of responsiveness helps us analyze some possibilities for non-Christian call and response settings. So I think of the call and response that people do in protests today, no justice, no peace, no racist police, as instantiating a lot of this. Individual protesters don't have to sum up their own philosophy. No justice, no peace articulates the community's perspective ever since the 80s and 90s, if you look into it, right? So it's this communally authored, really concise expression of what does the community want. And then it also has this seasonal aspect of adding in no racist police, kind of particularly in light of what's going on kind of today in the last few years, right? Being visible. Okay, so that's the narrow aspect. We can also think back to the broad aspect of what liturgy does and get some insight there. And I think what that really does is it allows us to evaluate and intervene, and here's where I want to step into more kind of racially interested analysis, which is evaluate and intervene not just in our habits, but especially in our racial habits. So here I'll be pulling from James K. Smith. And so for him, almost anything is liturgical. He has this really excellent exposition of how going to the mall is liturgical. From his perspective, that's because it shapes what you want and who you are and what you love. And therefore, liturgy means for him not just habit, but kind of adding on to what Bourdieu would say, a habit that should be evaluated. Is what we're being shaped into by going to the mall appropriate for who we are as Christians, or is it shaping us as capitalistic people who desire objects? I think right? Kind of even just posing the question already starts to break down some of our assumptions. And so his take on liturgy is that we are first and foremost loving, desiring, affective, liturgical animals who for the most part don't inhabit the world as thinkers or cognitive machines. So he's pushing against this idea that Christianity is first cognitive and about belief, and he says, no, it is first about action, and our beliefs are a reflection back on what we're doing. I think rhetorically what that does for us is it calls our bodies sites of persuasion. And what this means is that it's not just restricted to Christian practice. Kind of the parallel there to thinking about call and response, not restricted just to Christian practice, thinking about liturgical liturgy as habits to be evaluated makes us think about we are always engaged in liturgies or habits of grace. And by thinking about it as liturgy, it says, well, who is that shaping us to be? And can we intervene in this? So that sets up a lot of the theoretical kind of apparatus that I want to go to. Let me give a little bit of background on the field site that I was working with through this process. So we're talking about the city of Splitsville. All of these are pseudonyms here, some symbolically named, which is a northeast city that is relatively segregated. And specifically, I was working with people around an African-American neighborhood that they called Family Field. And so there were about 20 people from a mostly white church called Second Pres, and about 10 people from First Church, which was a mostly black, kind of racially mixed congregation. And this is coming out of a 3-year participatory project that was really catalyzed by the Black Lives Matter movement. And what that amounted to in practice was there was first a set of inter-church meetings between this basically completely white church and the African-American church. And then second, there was a set of ongoing meetings for white people to more actively take on the work of acting against racism. And so broadly, the people at the white church felt like they understood a lot of the ideas against racism, but felt very stuck about what to actually do. And so that's the context where I think that liturgy can kind of intervene in a few ways. So I have two adaptations that I observed in where people were really unselfconsciously adapting liturgy into this anti-racist work. Where are we at time-wise? Okay, great. So we have a little bit of time. So I'll try to talk through both of these briefly. So this first adaptation had to do with this set of inter-church meetings. There ended up being 4. There was a lot of scheduling challenges. And in particular, in the first meeting, no one from the black church came. So it was just people from the regular church, which was mostly white. There was one African-American woman who came, but everybody already knew her because they're all from the same church. So we come into the second meeting, and part of my methodology was to be a participant. So even though I wasn't at either of those churches, I attended those meetings. And so we come to the second one feeling a little unsure. Do they really want to do it? How's this going to be set up? And the way that it that we organized it was that it would be kind of a potluck style. And it was going to be right after church, and so there was this expectation that a lot of the African-American, there were going to be a lot more white people than black people at this meeting, which immediately poses a kind of problem. Who gets to talk in this meeting? Whose talking time is it? Now, the naive view is you need to manage it yourself, and what that's going to amount then is 75% talking time, roughly, from the white people and 25% or so from the African Americans. Well, you could say, okay, maybe we want to be a little bit more, honoring of the African Americans, extending. Maybe we need it to be kind of like half and half or something like that. But what I noticed about both of those intuitive approaches is that they treat the time in that meeting with a scarcity mindset, where it needs to be divided and allocated. And so it was me, a white coordinator whose name was Aviva, and then an African-American coordinator from the other church. And so what Aviva proposed is actually, why don't the white people just be quiet and just listen the whole time to the African American stories? Honestly, as the researcher, this was very early on, I thought it was going to crash and burn, and it would make for like an interesting anecdote in my dissertation about, oh, look at the white people trying to do this and failing. That's actually not what happened. The white people really did sit quiet in the meeting, and the black people kind of told their stories. And what's interesting to me about that is that that is a really challenging rhetorical move, to be receptive and to be quiet in that moment, especially for kind of where they were. You could argue, obviously, in a broader context, not that challenging, not that bad, right? But in this context, I would say significant. And what Aviva did was she set up the meeting by having us do a responsive call and response prayer together. So this was just right after church. The people at the mostly white second pres do this kind of stuff all the time, and so it's really recalling this effort. And the prayer that she chose was a prayer whose content also emphasized reversal. It was the prayer of St. Francis, which reads in part, where there is injury, let me bring love. Where there is where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. And so the prayer itself is trying to instantiate this reversal that the white people were themselves trying to enact. And in fact, later in the prayer, it authorizes that move through reference to Christ. Because it says, for it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born again to eternal life. So here I would say this counterintuitive, other-centered action of remaining quiet is taking on new life through this ancient prayer. Did the participants in this time really believe that they needed to bring love, or that they needed to pardon or be pardoned? In the meeting, bringing love meant being quiet as a small corrective to society's unequal racial treatment. And so joining the call and response makes that belief present and prepares them for the rest of the meeting. Just as kind of like a side note, this structure ended up being pretty memorable for the participants. Over a year later, one of the people who was there was talking about this in a completely separate context and brought it up, and she called it the one where white people were not supposed to talk. And we said, we're just gonna sit. And what I noticed about that recollection a year later is the plural pronoun we, because it figures that effort as collaborative among all of the white people. So it wasn't just something that, she resisted and we weren't allowed to talk. This was something where we said, we're just gonna sit. So that's that first adaptation. The second adaptation is significantly different, and that came in the context of trying to pray about race as potentially a mixed race setting. And this really comes back to the sense of potentially feeling stuck as a white person, feeling like there's no right way to do it. What do you say? You can't say the right thing. And kind of briefly, the person who led the meeting organized it as following a liturgical structure. And in fact, in one of those pieces, the idea was that one person would read a verse from a psalm, and then there would be an open time of prayer. And what that structure did was it structured the unplanned, spontaneous prayers that kind of followed. So this was right after Trump's election. It was a pretty raw, emotional time. And so, for instance, one of the people read out from the next verse from Psalm 12, the Lord will keep the needy safe and will protect us forever from the wicked. And one of the people who prayed in response to that drew on the language out of this prayer and helped her adopt two positions. First, she prayed as someone who is wicked. So she said, just help us to see the wickedness in our own hearts. And then she shifted to identify with the psalmist and to pray for God's protection, and she kind of converted the wicked there into people who are stirring up harm and fear and distrust. And she said, and I do pray that you would protect us from those who seek to harm, to create even more fear, and to stir up even more distrust. So overall, what we see in these two cases is that whereas Aviva in that first setting used call and response to help people be quiet, Gwen, the leader of the second prayer setting, adapted call and response to help draw people into new speech that was about race and was also enacting this kind of responsiveness. So these were two places where I saw people trying to draw on the resources of liturgy specifically in their effort to be against racism as white people. One set of implications that I think comes out of this is that religious rhetoric is often viewed skeptically as it regards anti-racism. I think a lot of presentations here even are, here's what's wrong. And obviously much of that skepticism is earned, but I think there may be elements like Christian liturgy that are unique to religious rhetoric that can support people who want to act against racism. And that part of our task as scholars of religious rhetoric is to identify those, to encourage those, and establish the study of religious rhetoric as something that is not just a deficit model. Okay. So, thank you.